Good evening, and welcome back to another journey through the quieter corners of history. Tonight, we're traveling far from the familiar castles and cathedrals of medieval Europe, crossing the Sahara's golden expanse to discover a world that once gleamed with scholarship, gold, and the gentle murmur of prayer calls echoing across ancient cities. Before we settle in together, if you enjoy what we do here, these quiet explorations of forgotten worlds, feel free to like the video and subscribe. It helps us continue bringing these stories to life. And I'm always curious to know, where are you listening from tonight? Drop a comment and let me know which corner of the world you're calling home. There's something wonderfully comforting about knowing we're all gathered here, scattered across the globe, sharing these moments with the past. Now, dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and let your mind drift back 7 centuries to a time when the greatest empire you've likely never heard of stretched across West Africa like a golden thread woven through the fabric of the medieval world. The Mali Empire. At its height in the 14th century, it was larger than Western Europe, richer than any kingdom of its time, and home to cities that served as beacons of learning when much of the world was still emerging from darker ages. Tonight, we'll walk the dusty streets of Timbuktu at the height of its glory. Follow the most extravagant pilgrimage in human history. Stand before the great mud walls of Jen and sit quietly with the griots, the living libraries who held entire civilizations in their memory. This is a world where gold was so abundant it was given away by the handful, where books were more precious than jewels, where massive adobe mosques rose like gentle mountains from the earth, and where the rhythm of daily life moved to the ancient beat of drums and the newer cadence of Islamic prayer. Let us begin in Timbuktu, in the soft light of a 14th century dawn, when the air still held the cool promise of morning before the desert sun claimed the day. Verse 1. Life in 14th century Timbuktu. The first light of dawn creeps across the flat rooftops of Timbuktu, painting the adobe walls in shades of rose and amber. It's 1350, perhaps, and the city is stirring with the gentle rhythm that has marked its mornings for generations. The call to prayer drifts from the Jingerber Mosque, its voice joining the softer sounds of a city awakening. The shuffle of leather sandals on packed earth, the distant lowing of cattle, the quiet conversations of early risers making their way to the wells. Timbuktu in the 14th century is not the remote outpost that modern minds might imagine. It is, instead, a cosmopolitan jewel set at the bend of the Niger River, where the waters curve like a protective arm around this remarkable city. Here, at the southern edge of the Sahara Desert, where the golden dunes meet the green of the Sudan grasslands, Timbuktu serves as the beating heart of the Mali Empire's intellectual and commercial life. Picture yourself walking through the Sanker Quarter as the morning light strengthens. The streets are narrow but purposeful, winding between compounds of sun-dried brick that house extended families behind high walls. The architecture speaks of both privacy and community walls that shelter private life, while flat rooftops serve as gathering spaces where neighbors might share the evening breeze and exchange the day's news. The air carries the scent of millet porridge, cooking over small fires, mixed with the dusty sweetness of dates and the sharp tang of fermented milk. Women emerge from their compounds, carrying large calabashes balanced effortlessly on their heads, making their way to the river or to one of the city's many wells. Their clothing is a fascinating blend of tradition's flowing robes that echo Islamic modesty, but in patterns and colors that speak to older West African aesthetics. Indigo blues, rich ochres, and the occasional flash of imported silk create a moving tapestry against the neutral backdrop of the mud brick architecture. The sound of children's voices begins to join the morning symphony. In Timbuktu, education is not a luxury, but a cornerstone of daily life. Young boys, their heads shaved and wearing simple white robes, hurry toward the Islamic schools that dot the city. They carry wooden tablets, their surfaces covered with verses from the Quran, written in elegant Arabic script. The older students, those who have progressed beyond basic literacy carry precious books wrapped carefully in leather or cloth volumes of Islamic law, mathematics, astronomy, and poetry that represent not just education, but wealth itself. For in Timbuktu, books are treasures in the most literal sense. The city's merchants understand that a single manuscript can be worth more than a horse, more than fine jewelry, more than most families might see in a year. The trade in books rivals the trade in gold and salt that has made the city famous across the known world. Scholars travel thousands of miles to access the libraries of Timbuktu, where Greek philosophy sits alongside Islamic theology, where mathematical treatises share shelf space with poetry, where the accumulated wisdom of multiple civilizations finds a home in this unlikely desert metropolis. As the morning progresses, the great market comes alive with an energy that is both urgent and unhurried, the particular rhythm of a place where serious business is conducted with civility and grace. A market of Timbuktu is not simply a place of commerce. It is the crossroads of Africa, the point where the trans-Saharan caravan routes meet the waters of the Niger River. Imagine the extraordinary diversity of this single marketplace. Tuareg merchants from the deep desert, their faces wrapped against sand and sun, overseeing the unloading of camels that have carried precious salt from the mines of Tagaza salt, so pure and valuable. It is cut into blocks like stone and traded like currency. Beside them, Sanink traders from the gold fields of Bambuk display their wares with the casual confidence of those who control the world's most precious metal. Fulani herders drive cattle toward the livestock market, their animals' bells creating a gentle percussion that mingles with human voices speaking Arabic, Mandinka, Songhai, and a dozen other languages. The goods on display would astonish a medieval European, not just the famous gold and salt, but ivory tusks as tall as a man, exotic birds in wicker cages, leather goods worked to incredible softness, cotton cloth dyed in colors that seem to capture sunlight itself. There are dates from the north, cola nuts from the south, copper ingots from mines that most of the world doesn't know exist, and always carefully guarded and precious beyond measure, books and manuscripts that represent the intellectual wealth of empires. The afternoon brings its own particular character to Timbuktu. As the heat builds, the city adopts the wisdom of the desert, a slower pace that acknowledges the power of the sun. Many retreat to the cool interiors of their homes, or to the shaded courtyards where extended families gather. This is when the city's famous hospitality becomes most apparent. In Timbuktu, the tradition of welcoming strangers is not just courtesy, but sacred duty. Travelers who have journeyed for months across dangerous desert routes find themselves not just tolerated, but genuinely welcomed, offered food, shelter, and the protection of their host's reputation. In these afternoon hours, when the heat creates a natural pause in the day's activities, the intellectual life of Timbuktu truly flourishes. Within the compounds of wealthy merchants and scholars, small groups gather around learned men who read from precious manuscripts, discussing points of Islamic law, debating mathematical problems, or exploring questions of astronomy. The University of Sankar, which will one day be spoken of in the same breath as the great institutions of Cairo and Baghdad, is not a single building, but a network of these private schools and libraries, a decentralized community of learning that makes all of Timbuktu itself a university. Picture a typical scholarly gathering. A dozen men seated on fine rugs in the shaded courtyard of a prosperous merchant's home. The teacher, perhaps a man who studied in Mecca or Cairo, reads from a treatise on Islamic jurisprudence, while his students follow along in their own copies, if they are fortunate enough to own them. The discussion that follows is conducted in Arabic, the language of scholarship, but it is enriched by the diverse backgrounds of the participants. A question about water rights might draw on desert traditions maintained by Tuareg nomads, while a point about trade ethics might be illuminated by the practical experience of Sanink merchants. These are not abstract academic exercises. The scholars of Timbuktu understand that knowledge must serve life, that learning has value only when it improves the human condition. Their discussions of mathematics help merchants calculate complex exchange rates between different currencies and commodities. Their studies of astronomy guide caravans across trackless desert expanses. Their mastery of Islamic law helps resolve disputes between traders from different cultures and traditions. As evening approaches, Timbuktu takes on yet another character. The heat begins to lift, and the city stirs back to full life. The call to Maghrib prayer echoes from the city's mosques, and for a few moments, the commercial bustle pauses as the faithful turn toward Mecca. But this is not the rigid observance that some might expect. Islam in 14th century Timbuktu is a faith that has learned to coexist gracefully with older traditions, creating something uniquely West African. After prayers, as the sun begins its descent toward the horizon, families gather on their rooftops to enjoy the evening breeze. Children who spent the day in Quranic school now play games that their grandparents played before Islam came to this land. Young men and women, carefully chaperoned, but not entirely segregated, exchange glances and quiet words that speak to the universal human experiences that transcend culture and century. The evening meal in a prosperous Timbuktu household is a reflection of the city's cosmopolitan character. The staples are West African millet, sorghum, rice from the Niger's fertile floodplains, but the preparation shows influences from across the Islamic world. Spices carried by caravan from as far away as India add complexity to stews that might also include meat from the Fulani herds, fish from the Niger, or dates from the Saharan oasis. Conversation around the evening meal moves easily between languages and topics. A father might discuss the day's business in Mandinka, while his eldest son, recently returned from studies in Cairo, offers observations in Arabic. A visiting scholar might be invited to share news from distant lands, while the women of the household, though eating separately, make their voices heard through questions and comments that demonstrate their own considerable education. For in Timbuktu, the education of women is not forbidden, merely conducted differently. Wealthy families often ensure that their daughters can read Arabic, understand Islamic law, and manage the complex household economies that are essential to maintaining their family status. Some women become accomplished poets or religious scholars in their own right, though their influence is exercised through family networks rather than public forums. As full darkness settles over the city, Timbuktu's unique position becomes almost magical. Here, at the meeting point of desert and river, of Arab and African, of ancient tradition and new faith, the night air carries sounds and scents that speak to the complexity of human civilization. The distant drums of traditional celebrations mingle with the chanting of Quranic verses. The scent of frankincense from religious ceremonies blends with the homier smells of cooking fires and livestock. The night also brings its own forms of learning and entertainment. In the courtyards of the wealthy, oil lamps illuminate manuscripts while scholars continue their discussions deep into the night. But there are other gatherings as well, where griots, the traditional oral historians, weave together ancient stories and current events, creating narratives that preserve the history and values of their people, in forms that will survive in memory long after paper and ink have crumbled. The security that allows for such evening gatherings speaks to one of Timbuktu's greatest achievements, its position as a neutral ground where different peoples can meet in relative safety. The Mali Empire's governance, which we will explore more deeply in our next segment, has created conditions where a Berber merchant from the north can sit peacefully beside a Mandinka scholar from the south, where religious and cultural differences are sources of richness rather than conflict. Even the city's physical layout reflects this remarkable tolerance. The Sankar Quarter houses the Great Mosque and University. The Sarakena Quarter serves as the palace district for local governors, and the Daindri Bear Quarter centers around another grand mosque. But these are not rigid segregations. People move freely between districts, worship at different mosques depending on convenience or preference, and participate in a civic life that values learning, commerce, and faith in roughly equal measure. As the night deepens and the city gradually settles into sleep, Timbuktu in the 14th century reveals itself as something almost miraculous, a place where the best impulses of human civilization have found expression in the most unlikely setting. Here, at the edge of one of the world's most challenging deserts, a community has created something that rivals the greatest cities of its era, not through conquest or domination, but through the patient cultivation of knowledge, trade, and mutual respect. The last sounds of the evening might be a scholar reading quietly to himself by lamplight, the gentle conversation of family members settling in for the night, or the distant call of a night watchman making his rounds. These are the sounds of a city at peace with itself, confident in its place in the world, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow will bring new caravans, new books, new ideas, and new opportunities to demonstrate that human beings, despite their differences, can indeed create something beautiful together. This is Timbuktu at its height, not the remote, exotic destination of European imagination, but a vibrant, sophisticated metropolis that stands as one of the great achievements of medieval civilization. In the gentle rhythm of its daily life, we can hear echoes of something that seems almost too good to be true. A place where learning flourished, where trade brought prosperity without corruption, where different faiths and cultures enriched rather than threatened each other. Tomorrow, the sun will rise again over the flat rooftops and narrow streets, and the cycle will begin anew. But tonight, as we leave the sleeping city to its dreams, we carry with us a vision of what human beings are capable of when they choose cooperation over conflict, knowledge over ignorance, and hope over fear. Verse 2. The Hajj of Mansa Musa the year is 1324, and across the known world, from the courts of Cairo to the trading posts of Venice, from the scholarly circles of Baghdad to the merchant houses of Constantinople, people are speaking in hushed, almost disbelieving tones about something unprecedented. A king from the heart of Africa, a place most have never seen, ruling an empire most have never heard of, has undertaken a pilgrimage so magnificent, so impossibly lavish, that it has left every city along his route fundamentally changed. His name is Mansa Musa, and he rules the Mali Empire at the absolute height of its power. But to understand the magnitude of what he accomplished, we must first understand the man himself and the world he inhabited before he set out on the journey that would make him a legend. Imagine, if you will, the royal compound at Niani, the capital of Mali, in the months before Musa's departure. The compound itself is a marvelous sprawling complex of adobe, buildings arranged around courtyards where the business of empire is conducted with a mixture of ancient African tradition and newer Islamic protocol. Here, in halls whose walls are adorned with intricate geometric patterns that echo the decorative traditions of both Mecca and the ancestral kingdoms of the Sudan, the most powerful ruler in Africa prepares for the most important journey of his life. Mansa Musa, the title Mansa, means emperor or king of kings, is not a man given to small gestures. He has inherited not just a throne, but a legacy of conquest and consolidation that has made Mali the largest empire in the world. Under his rule, the empire stretches from the Atlantic coast to the bend of the Niger River, encompassing the gold fields of Bambouk and Bure, the salt mines of Tagaza, and the great trading cities that serve as gateways between the Islamic world and sub-Saharan Africa. But for all his earthly power, Mansa Musa is a devout Muslim, and the pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj, represents not just a religious obligation, but a spiritual calling that speaks to something deeper than political ambition. In the quiet hours before dawn, as he performs his morning prayers in the private mosque within his compound, Musa contemplates the journey ahead, not as a display of wealth or power, but as an act of submission to Allah that will cleanse his soul and fulfill one of the fundamental requirements of his faith. Yet this is also a man who understands that every act of an emperor is inherently political, that his pilgrimage will serve not just his spiritual needs, but also the interests of his empire. The Islamic world knows little of Mali beyond vague reports of a wealthy kingdom somewhere in the African interior. Musa's journey will announce Mali's presence on the world stage, establish diplomatic relationships with the great powers of the Islamic world, and demonstrate that the kings of Africa can match the grandeur of any ruler in Cairo or Baghdad. The preparations for the journey take nearly a year and involve the mobilization of resources on a scale that defies easy comprehension. Picture the scene. Across the empire, tribute flows toward the capital, not in the usual forms of agricultural produce or crafted goods, but in the form that will make this pilgrimage legendary: gold. Gold dust carried in leather pouches by traders from Bambouk. Gold nuggets from the rivers of Bure, some as large as a child's fist. Gold ornaments and jewelry created by the empire's master craftsmen, worked into forms that blend Islamic geometric patterns with traditional African artistic motifs. But gold is only part of the preparation. The caravan that will accompany Mansa Musa to Mecca must be able to sustain itself across thousands of miles of desert, savanna, and settled territory. Imagine the logistics. Provisions for a journey that will take more than a year, gifts appropriate for the rulers and holy men they will encounter, trade goods that can be exchanged for local currencies and supplies, and enough extra wealth to maintain the dignity of the Mali Empire's representation in every city along the route. The human component of the caravan is equally staggering. Contemporary accounts vary, but most agree that Mansa Musa traveled with a retinue of between 60,000 and 80,000 people. These are not just soldiers and servants, though both are well represented. The caravan includes scholars who will study at the great centers of Islamic learning, merchants who will establish trade relationships for the empire, craftsmen who will learn new techniques to bring back to Mali, and diplomats who will negotiate agreements with foreign powers. There are also the enslaved people, for this is the 14th century, and slavery is an accepted institution across both the Islamic world and sub-Saharan Africa. But even here, Mansa Musa's caravan reflects the complex realities of his empire. Some of the enslaved people are war captives, taken in Mali's campaigns of expansion. Others are individuals who have sold themselves or been sold by their families to escape famine or other disasters. Still others are skilled artisans or educated individuals, whose bondage is more akin to indentured servitude than the chattel slavery that will later devastate Africa. As the great caravan finally sets out from Niani in 1324, it stretches for miles across the landscape, a moving city that transforms every place it touches. At its head rides Mansa Musa himself, mounted on a horse whose bridle and saddle are worked with gold, surrounded by his personal guard carrying spears tipped with gold, followed by his wives and children traveling in howdahs atop camels whose saddle cloths are embroidered with golden thread. Behind the royal party comes the true heart of the caravan's legendary wealth: 100 camels, each carrying 300 pounds of gold dust. Picture these animals, carefully selected for their strength and endurance, moving with the patient, measured gait that has carried trade across the Sahara for centuries. Their loads, secured in leather bags and wooden chests, represent wealth beyond the imagination of most medieval rulers. Approximately 30,000 pounds of gold, worth billions in modern currency. The journey begins with a route that takes the caravan northeast across the savanna grasslands of Mali, through territories where Mansa Musa's authority is absolute. Here, local chiefs and governors come out to meet their emperor, offering additional supplies and tribute, receiving in return the honor of his presence and generous gifts that reinforce their loyalty to the throne. The caravan moves slowly, covering perhaps 15 or 20 miles per day, allowing time for these ceremonial meetings and for the complex logistics of moving such a massive group across the landscape. As they approach the edge of the Sahara, the character of the journey changes. The lush grasslands give way to the harsh beauty of the desert, and the caravan must adapt to a new rhythm, dictated by the availability of water and the need to shelter from the sun during the hottest part of the day. Here, Mansa Musa demonstrates not just wealth but wisdom, relying on the expertise of Tuareg guides who know every well, every landmark, every danger of the Great Desert. The crossing of the Sahara takes months, and it is during this phase of the journey that the caravan truly becomes a legend. At each oasis town, the local inhabitants witness something unprecedented, a procession of wealth and dignity that transforms their understanding of what lies beyond the southern horizon. In Walada, the first major stop, Mansa Musa's generosity is so overwhelming that the local economy is disrupted for years afterward. Gold dust is distributed with such casual abundance that the value of gold in the local markets plummets. But it is when the caravan reaches Cairo that Mansa Musa's pilgrimage becomes truly historic. Cairo in 1324 is one of the greatest cities in the world, capital of the Mamluk Sultanate and a center of Islamic learning and culture that rivals Baghdad or Damascus. The Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad, himself a ruler of immense wealth and power, receives reports of the approaching African caravan with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Surely, his advisors suggest, the reports of this Mansa Musa's wealth have been exaggerated by desert traders prone to tall tales. The reality exceeds even the most extravagant rumors. When Mansa Musa enters Cairo, he does so with a ceremony that leaves the sophisticated residents of one of the world's greatest cities speechless with amazement. The procession that winds through the narrow streets of the ancient city is like something from a dream. Hundreds of slaves dressed in fine silk, each carrying a staff of solid gold. Camels whose loads of gold dust glitter in the Egyptian sun. Warriors whose weapons and armor incorporate more precious metal than most armies possess in total. And at the center of it all, Mansa Musa himself, a figure of such dignity and obvious power that even the blaze courtiers of Cairo find themselves awed. The meeting between Mansa Musa and Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad becomes a diplomatic dance of extraordinary delicacy. Both men are proud rulers accustomed to deference, but the protocols of Islamic kingship provide a framework for their interaction. Mansa Musa, despite his obvious wealth, acknowledges the Sultan's theoretical superiority as a ruler closer to the holy cities of Islam. The Sultan, despite his initial skepticism, cannot help but be impressed by the obvious power and sophistication of his African visitor. The gifts exchanged between the two rulers are magnificent even by the standards of medieval royal diplomacy. Mansa Musa presents the Sultan with quantities of gold that astound even the wealthy Egyptian court. In return, he receives horses, fine textiles, books, and other goods that will demonstrate Mali's connections to the broader Islamic world. But more importantly, he receives recognition acknowledgement from one of Islam's most powerful rulers that Mali is a legitimate member of the community of Islamic nations. During his stay in Cairo, which lasts several months, Mansa Musa becomes a figure of fascination for the city's merchants, scholars, and courtiers. His conversations with Islamic legal scholars demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of religious law. His discussions with merchants reveal a keen grasp of international trade and economics. His meetings with geographers and historians provide them with information about the African interior that fills significant gaps in their understanding of the world. But it is his spending that truly transforms Cairo. With the casual generosity of a man for whom gold is more common than silver, Mansa Musa distributes wealth throughout the city. He tips servants with gold dust, buys luxury goods with handfuls of gold nuggets, and makes charitable donations to mosques and schools that exceed their annual budgets. The economic impact is immediate and dramatic. So much gold enters the Cairo market that its value collapses, creating an inflationary spiral that affects prices for more than a decade. Contemporary chroniclers struggle to find words adequate to describe what they witness. Al-Umari, one of the most reliable historians of the period, writes that Mansa Musa's generosity was so great that he left no court emir nor holder of a royal office without the gift of a load of gold. The phrase load of gold here is not metaphorical Mansa Musa, literally gives away camel loads of precious metal as casual gifts. When the caravan finally departs Cairo for Mecca, it carries with it not just the prayers and good wishes of the Egyptian court, but also a fundamentally changed understanding of Africa's place in the Islamic world. The maps that European cartographers will draw for centuries afterward will feature a figure identified as the King of Mali, depicted holding a golden orb and wearing a crown, a visual representation of the impression that Mansa Musa has made on the medieval world. The pilgrimage itself, when the caravan finally reaches the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, is conducted with the same magnificent dignity that has characterized the entire journey. Mansa Musa performs the prescribed rituals of the Hajj with sincere devotion, walking 7 times around the Kaaba, praying at the sacred sites, participating in the ceremonies that unite all Muslims, regardless of their earthly rank or wealth. Here, in the most sacred places of Islam, the Emperor of Mali becomes simply one pilgrim among many, equal in the eyes of Allah with the humblest believer. But even in this sacred context, Mansa Musa's impact is transformative. His charitable donations to the holy cities are so substantial that they fund major construction projects and support thousands of poor pilgrims. The relationships he establishes with scholars and holy men from across the Islamic world create networks of learning and trade that will benefit Mali for generations to come. The return journey, undertaken in 1325, follows a different route that takes the caravan through the great trading cities of the Eastern Sahara. By now, word of Mansa Musa's pilgrimage has spread throughout the Islamic world, and everywhere he goes, he is received not as an exotic curiosity from the African interior, but as a powerful and important ruler whose friendship is worth cultivating. When Mansa Musa finally returns to Mali in 1325, he brings with him more than just the spiritual benefits of having completed the Hajj. He returns with architects and scholars who will help build new mosques and schools, with books and manuscripts that will enrich Mali's libraries, with diplomatic agreements that will facilitate trade, and with a reputation that has made Mali famous throughout the known world. The transformation is immediate and lasting. For the first time, Mali appears on the maps of the world not as a blank space or a vague reference to the land of gold, but as a real place with a real ruler whose power and wealth are acknowledged by the greatest courts of the age. Trade routes that had previously bypassed Mali now seek out its markets. Scholars and merchants who had never considered venturing into the African interior now make their way to Timbuktu and other Mali cities. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Mansa Musa's pilgrimage is what it reveals about the character of its central figure. Here is a man who possessed wealth beyond the dreams of most rulers, who could have spent his life in luxury and ease, yet who chose to undertake a dangerous journey of thousands of miles, driven by genuine religious devotion. The contemporary accounts all emphasize not just his wealth, but his piety, his generosity, his dignity, and his wisdom. In the quiet evening hours, as we imagine Mansa Musa back in his palace at Niani, reflecting on his great journey, we can sense something of the satisfaction that comes from having accomplished something truly extraordinary. He has not just completed a religious obligation. He has announced to the world that Africa is home to civilizations that can rival any on Earth. He has demonstrated that power and wealth, when guided by faith and wisdom, can be forces for good in the world. The ripple effects of his pilgrimage will continue for centuries. European maps will feature the King of Mali long after the empire itself has faded. The trade routes established during his journey will continue to bring wealth and knowledge to West Africa. The diplomatic relationships he forged will facilitate cultural exchange between Mali and the broader Islamic world. But on this quiet night, as the great emperor settles into sleep in his palace of sun-dried brick, surrounded by the familiar sounds of his capital city, perhaps the most remarkable thing about Mansa Musa's great pilgrimage is simply this: it happened in an age when most rulers never traveled more than a few hundred miles from their birthplace. When the world seemed vast and unknowable, one man from the heart of Africa undertook a journey that connected civilizations and changed the course of history. The golden caravan has returned home, but its legend will echo through the centuries. A reminder that greatness can emerge from the most unexpected places, and that the human capacity for vision, courage, and generosity knows no boundaries of race, culture, or geography. Verse 3. The great mosque of Jen, in the soft light of early morning, when the mist from the Bani River still clings to the ancient walls of Jin, there stands a building that seems to have grown from the earth itself, rising from the red-brown soil of the Niger River Delta, like a gentle mountain of sculpted clay. The great mosque of Jen presents itself to the world as perhaps the most remarkable example of Sudano-Sahelian architecture ever created. A structure so harmoniously integrated with its environment, so perfectly adapted to its climate and culture, that it appears less built than born. This is not the stark geometry of stone cathedrals or the soaring minarets of Middle Eastern mosques. This is something entirely different, an architecture that speaks in the ancient language of earth and water, sun and rain, community and faith. The great Mosque of Jen, as it stood in the 14th century during the height of the Mali Empire, represents one of humanity's most successful attempts to create sacred space using nothing more than the materials that lie literally beneath one's feet. To understand this remarkable building, we must first understand the city that surrounds it and the people who created it. Jin, located on an island in the seasonal floodplains of the Bani River, has been inhabited for over 2,000 years. Long before Islam arrived in West Africa, this was a place where communities gathered, where trade flourished, where the annual flood cycle created both challenge and opportunity for human settlement. The location is both blessing and constraint. During the rainy season, from roughly June to October, the waters rise and Jen becomes truly an island, accessible only by boat or canoe. During the dry season, the waters recede, leaving behind fertile soil perfect for agriculture and trade roads that connect the city to the broader network of West African commerce. It is a place that has taught its inhabitants to live in harmony with natural cycles, to build not in defiance of the environment, but in partnership with it. The mosque itself embodies this philosophy completely. Picture, if you will, the building as it appeared in its 14th century glory, not the reconstruction that modern visitors see today, but the original structure that rose from the labor and vision of medieval West African architects and craftsmen. The building stretches nearly 250 feet in length and 130 feet in width, making it one of the largest religious structures in sub-Saharan Africa. But size alone does not capture its remarkable character. The walls, some 4 feet thick at their base, are built entirely of sun-dried mud bricks in the local language bound together with a mortar made from mud, rice husks, and other organic materials that create a surprisingly strong and flexible building material. But the true genius of the construction lies not in the bricks themselves, but in the wooden framework that supports the entire structure. Imagine the skeleton of this great building, massive wooden beams carefully selected from trees that grow in the region's forests, forming an internal framework that bears the weight of the mud walls while allowing them to expand and contract with changes in temperature and humidity. These are not random timbers, but carefully engineered structural elements, positioned according to architectural principles that have been refined over centuries of building in this challenging environment. The exterior walls are not smooth but deliberately textured, covered with a coating of smooth mud plaster that must be renewed annually. And here lies one of the most remarkable aspects of the great mosque's story. The building is not meant to endure through permanence, but through constant renewal, not through resistance to the elements, but through adaptation and community care. Rising from the main body of the mosque are 3 minarets, each one a masterpiece of mud architecture. These are not the slender stone towers of Middle Eastern mosques, but broad, substantial structures that seem to anchor the building to the earth while reaching toward heaven. Their surfaces are adorned with projecting wooden beams torn in the local architectural vocabulary that serve both practical and aesthetic purposes. The toran are perhaps the most distinctive feature of Sudano-Sahelian architecture, and they perfectly embody the marriage of function and beauty that characterizes this building tradition. Practically, these wooden beams serve as permanent scaffolding, allowing workers to climb the walls during the annual replastering without need for additional equipment. Aesthetically, they create a rhythmic pattern that softens the massive bulk of the walls, giving the entire structure a sense of organic growth rather than imposed construction. The interior of the mosque is a space designed for both worship and community gathering, reflecting the dual role that mosques play in Islamic society. The prayer hall is supported by massive mud brick columns, each one carefully shaped and proportioned to bear its share of the roof's weight while creating an interior space that feels both intimate and grand. The floor is packed earth, smooth and clean, covered with mats woven from local grasses and fibers. Light enters the prayer hall through carefully positioned windows and openings, creating a play of shadow and illumination that changes throughout the day and seasons. The architects of medieval Jain understood that in their climate, controlling light was as important as controlling temperature and humidity. The thick walls and strategic openings create a cool, dim interior that provides refuge from the intense heat of the dry season, while remaining warm and comfortable during the cooler months. But the true marvel of the Great Mosque of Jen is not revealed in any single architectural feature, but in the annual ritual that ensures its survival, the festival of replastering that transforms the entire community into a construction crew for one extraordinary day each year. Picture this scene, which has been repeated for centuries. As the rainy season ends and the floodwaters begin to recede, the people of Jen begin preparing for one of the most important events in their civic calendar. This is not merely maintenance, but celebration. Not just practical necessity, but community affirmation. The annual replastering of the Great Mosque is a festival that brings together every segment of society in a collective act of devotion and civic pride. The preparation begins weeks in advance. Clay is collected from specific sites around the city, mixed with water and organic additives, according to recipes that have been passed down through generations of master builders. The mixture must achieve exactly the right consistency. Too wet, and it will not adhere properly. Too dry, and it will crack and fall away. This is knowledge held by the traditional builders, the Mabas, who serve as both craftsmen and custodians of architectural wisdom. On the appointed day, usually falling in the spring, when the weather is neither too hot nor too wet, the entire city participates in a ritual that is part construction project, part religious festival, and part community celebration. Men, women, and children all have roles to play. The men typically handle the physically demanding work of carrying mud and applying plaster to the higher walls, climbing on the torn beams with the agility born of lifelong familiarity with their mosque's architecture. Women prepare the plaster mixture, adding water and organic materials in proportions that must be judged by experience rather than measurement. Children carry tools and materials, learning through participation the skills they will need when they become the mosque's next generation of caretakers. Even visitors to the city are invited to participate, welcomed into a tradition that emphasizes community over individuality, collective responsibility over personal achievement. The work begins before dawn and continues throughout the day, accompanied by music, singing, and the kind of good-natured competition that makes labor feel like celebration. Different neighborhoods compete to see who can complete their assigned section most quickly and skillfully. Traditional drummers provide rhythm for the work, while praise singers celebrate the efforts of particularly dedicated workers. But this is not chaotic enthusiasm. The replastering follows carefully established patterns and procedures overseen by master craftsmen who ensure that the work meets traditional standards. Each section of the wall requires specific treatment. The lower walls, which bear the greatest structural load, and face the most severe weather exposure receive the thickest coating of plaster. The upper walls and decorative elements require more delicate treatment, with smoother finishes that highlight the building's architectural details. The torn beams themselves receive special attention during the annual replastering. These wooden elements, constantly exposed to sun, rain, and temperature extremes, must be carefully inspected and, when necessary, replaced. The selection of new Torin requires considerable expertise. The wood must be properly seasoned, cut to precise dimensions, and installed in ways that maintain the structural integrity of the walls while preserving the aesthetic harmony of the building. As the day progresses and sections of fresh plaster begin to cover the weathered walls of the previous year, the mosque is literally reborn before the eyes of its community. The new coating, still damp and rich brown from the river clay, gives the entire building a fresh, vital appearance that speaks to the successful marriage of human effort and natural materials. The completion of the replastering is marked by prayers of thanksgiving and community celebration that can continue late into the night. Food is shared, stories are told, and the year's work is celebrated not just as successful maintenance, but as successful community cooperation. The mosque stands renewed, ready to serve its congregation for another year, while the community that cares for it has reaffirmed its bonds of mutual responsibility and shared pride. This annual ritual reveals something profound about the relationship between architecture and community in traditional West African society. The Great Mosque of Jen is not just a building that the community uses. It is a building that the community creates anew each year through collective effort. It belongs to the people not through ownership, but through participation, not through legal title, but through annual labor and care. The architectural techniques embodied in the Great Mosque represent centuries of experimentation and refinement in building with local materials under challenging environmental conditions. The thick walls provide thermal mass that moderates interior temperatures throughout the daily and seasonal cycles. The organic additives in the mud plaster help prevent cracking and improve weather resistance. The wooden framework allows the building to flex slightly with ground movement and thermal expansion without suffering structural damage. But beyond these practical considerations, the mosque represents a distinctive aesthetic achievement that demonstrates the creative possibilities inherent in earth architecture. The building's sculptural qualities, its integration with the natural environment, and its organic textures create an architectural experience quite different from stone or brick construction. This is architecture that acknowledges its material origins, that celebrates rather than conceals the fact that it is made from the same earth that surrounds it. The influence of the Great Mosque of Jen extends far beyond its immediate community. The Sudano-Sahelian architectural style that it exemplifies has been adapted and modified throughout the Western Sudan, from Senegal to Chad. Mosques, palaces, and ordinary dwellings throughout the region show the influence of architectural principles, first perfected in buildings like the Great Mosque of Jen. The building also represents a remarkable synthesis of local and international influences. While the basic construction techniques and materials are thoroughly West African, the buildings function as a mosque, and some of its architectural details reflect the influence of Islamic architecture from North Africa and the Middle East. The result is not a copy of foreign models, but a uniquely African interpretation of Islamic architectural principles. In the quiet hours after sunset, when the daily prayers have been completed and the community has dispersed to their homes, the Great Mosque of Jen settles into the peaceful rhythm of night. The thick walls, still warm from the day's heat, gradually release their stored energy into the cool night air. The building breathes with the natural cycles of temperature and humidity, expanding and contracting slightly, adjusting to the changing conditions with the flexibility that centuries of architectural wisdom have built into its very structure. Standing in the moonlight, the mosque presents a silhouette that seems both ancient and timeless. Its massive forms, softened by the organic curves of hand-applied plaster, create a building that appears to have emerged from the earth through some natural process rather than human construction. The Torin beams, casting intricate patterns of shadow on the walls, add texture and rhythm to surfaces that might otherwise seem monotonous. This is architecture as living tradition rather than frozen monument. Unlike stone buildings that endure through resistance to change, the Great Mosque of Jen endures through constant adaptation, annual renewal, and community participation. It survives not because it is impervious to time and weather, but because it has created a system that incorporates time and weather into its very existence. The mosque stands as a testament to the possibility of sustainable architecture building that works with rather than against natural systems, that creates beauty through harmony rather than dominance, that serves human needs while respecting environmental limits. In an age increasingly concerned with environmental responsibility and community resilience, the Great Mosque of Jen offers lessons that extend far beyond its specific time and place. As the night deepens over the ancient city, the mosque rests secure in the knowledge that tomorrow will bring new prayers, new gatherings, new opportunities to serve its community. And when the seasons turn and the time comes for annual renewal, the building knows that the hands and hearts that created it will gather once again to ensure its continuation for another year, another generation, another century of faithful service. The Great Mosque of Jen, rising from the earth and returning to it through endless cycles of renewal, embodies something essential about human creativity and community cooperation. It reminds us that the most enduring buildings are not necessarily the strongest or most permanent, but those that create the deepest connections between human beings and the places they call home. Verse 4, the world of Agrayat in the hushed evening hours, when the last light of day fades from the compound walls and the first stars appear in the vast West African sky, a different kind of illumination begins to fill the courtyards of Mali. It comes not from oil lamps or fires, but from the voice of Agrayat, one of the remarkable oral historians, whose memory holds the accumulated wisdom, genealogies, and stories of an entire civilization. Tonight, we enter their world, a realm where history lives not on written pages, but in human hearts, where the past is not a distant country, but an ever-present companion, and where the power of voice and music can transform ordinary moments into connections with the eternal. The Agrayat sits cross-legged on a woven mat, his kora a 21-stringed harp lute, whose gourd body gleams in the firelight, cradled in his hands like a living thing. Around him, in the comfortable semicircle that forms naturally when stories are to be told, members of the household settle in for an evening that will be both entertainment and education, both art and historical record. This is Mamadou Kouyaté, though his name could be any of the hereditary surnames that mark the Agrayat families of West Africa Diabate, Sissoko, Koni, names that carry with them centuries of accumulated responsibility and respect. To understand the world of the Agrayat is to understand a fundamentally different relationship between past and present, between individual and community, between art and function. In the literate societies that most of us inhabit, history is something that happens to other people in other times, preserved in books and documents that we can choose to read or ignore. But in the oral traditions of medieval West Africa, history is a living presence, maintained and transmitted by human beings who serve as both artists and archivists, both entertainers and educators. Mamadou learned his craft not in schools, but at the feet of his father and grandfather, in a tradition of education that stretches back through generations of Agrayats to the very foundations of West African civilization. From earliest childhood, he absorbed not just the techniques of musical performance, but the vast repertoire of stories, genealogies, proverbs, and historical accounts that formed the intellectual inheritance of his people. This education was rigorous in ways that formal schooling can barely match. Every story had to be learned perfectly, not just in its broad outline, but in its precise details, its proper rhythm, its traditional embellishments. Every genealogy had to be memorized completely, with the ability to trace family connections back through dozens of generations. Every praise song had to be mastered not just as performance, but as historical document, for the Griots serve as the keepers of reputation, the arbiters of honor, the living record of who did, what and when and why. But the Griots' role extends far beyond simple memorization and recitation. In the courts of Mali's rulers, Griots served as advisors, diplomats, and political commentators. Their deep knowledge of precedent and tradition made them invaluable counselors to kings, who needed to understand how current situations compared to past events. Their skill in praise and criticism gave them unique power to influence public opinion and political outcomes. Their ability to trace genealogies made them essential to the complex negotiations of marriage, inheritance, and political alliance that shaped medieval African society. Picture Mamadou in his prime, perhaps 30 years old, as he enters the court of a local ruler to perform his most important function, the recitation of the ruler's genealogy and the great deeds of his ancestors. This is not mere flattery, but a form of historical accounting that serves multiple purposes simultaneously. For the ruler, it provides public confirmation of his legitimacy and connection to the great figures of the past. For the assembled audience, it offers education in the history and values of their society. For the Griot himself, it represents the fulfillment of his hereditary obligation to preserve and transmit the cultural memory of his people. The performance begins with the slow, hypnotic plucking of the chorus strings, a musical introduction that signals the transition from ordinary conversation to formal historical recitation. The instrument itself is a marvel of traditional craftsmanship, a large gourd cut in half and covered with cowhide, supporting a long wooden neck from which 21 strings stretch in perfect tension. The sound it produces is unlike any Western instrument, capable of both delicate melodic lines and complex rhythmic patterns that can carry a narrative for hours without repetition or monotony. As Mamadou begins to sing, his voice takes on the particular quality that marks the trained Griot, not the operatic power of European classical music, but a more intimate conversational tone that can rise to moments of dramatic intensity or drop to whispers that draw the audience into conspiracy with the storyteller. The language shifts fluidly between ordinary speech and the heightened, poetic diction reserved for formal historical recitation, creating a performance that is both accessible and elevated, both familiar and extraordinary. Listen, people of this house, he begins, his fingers finding the opening melody that will carry the genealogy of the ruling family. Listen to the names of those who came before, who built the foundations upon which we stand, who fought the battles that secured our peace, who made the choices that shaped our destiny. From Sundiata, the Lion King who founded our great empire, to the present day, I will tell you the names and deeds that make us who we are. The genealogy that follows is not a dry recitation of names and dates, but a living narrative that weaves individual lives into the larger story of West African civilization. Each ancestor is presented not as a distant historical figure, but as a person whose choices and actions continue to influence the present moment. The warrior who secured a crucial victory in battle becomes a model for contemporary courage. The wise queen who negotiated a difficult peace becomes an example for current diplomatic challenges. The merchant who established profitable trade relationships becomes a guide for present-day economic decisions. But the Griot's knowledge extends beyond the genealogies of ruling families to encompass the full spectrum of his society's cultural memory. He knows the stories that explain how the world came to be, why certain customs are observed, how particular technologies were discovered or acquired. He knows the praise songs for different professions, the hunters who protect the community from dangerous animals, the blacksmiths who transform raw metal into tools and weapons, the farmers whose labor feeds everyone, the merchants whose travels bring wealth and knowledge from distant lands. Each profession has its own cycle of stories and songs, its own traditional heroes and cautionary tales. The hunter's stories tell of encounters with powerful spirits in the deep forest, of the courage required to face dangerous animals, of the mystical knowledge needed to track and kill without disturbing the spiritual balance of the natural world. The blacksmith's stories speak of the transformation of base metal into useful objects, of the sacred knowledge required to work with fire and iron, of the respect due to those who practice this essential but potentially dangerous craft. As the evening progresses and the formal genealogy gives way to other forms of storytelling, Mamadou's role shifts from historian to entertainer, from keeper of official records to explorer of human nature in all its complexity. The stories he tells now are the ones that have been polished by generations of telling, refined through countless performances into perfect gems of narrative art. There are trickster tales featuring Anansi the spider, stories that use humor and cleverness to explore serious questions about power, wisdom, and human nature. There are love stories that examine the complexities of human relationships while celebrating the beauty and mystery of romantic attraction. There are adventure stories that follow heroes through dangerous journeys, testing their courage, wisdom, and character against impossible odds. But perhaps most importantly, there are the stories that directly address the moral and ethical questions that face every human society. Through the vehicle of narrative, the Griot explores questions that might be difficult to address directly. How should power be exercised? What obligations do the strong have to the weak? How should conflicts be resolved? What is the proper relationship between individual ambition and community welfare? These stories work on multiple levels simultaneously. Children hear exciting tales of adventure and magic. Adults recognize the deeper philosophical and ethical questions being explored. Political leaders find guidance for their own decision-making processes. The same story can be entertainment, education, moral instruction, and political commentary, depending on the needs of the audience and the skill of the teller. The Griot's instrument, the kora, is essential to this multi-layered communication. The music doesn't simply accompany the words, but comments on them, emphasizes certain phrases, provides emotional coloring that guides the audience's response. A shift in rhythm can signal a change in mood or meaning. A particular melodic phrase can identify a character or situation, even before it's explicitly mentioned in the words. The instrument becomes a second voice in the performance, sometimes supporting the singer's narrative, sometimes offering counterpoint or commentary. As the night deepens and the formal performances give way to more intimate conversation, Mamadou's role shifts again. Now he becomes counselor and confidant, using his vast knowledge of human nature and social dynamics to offer advice to individuals who seek his guidance. A young man uncertain about a proposed marriage might ask for stories about successful and failed relationships from the past. A merchant planning a dangerous trading expedition might request tales of others who faced similar challenges. A ruler struggling with a difficult decision might seek precedents from the experiences of earlier leaders. This counseling function of the Griot represents one of the most important but least visible aspects of their social role. In societies where most people cannot read and write, where formal education is limited to a small elite, the Griot serves as a walking library of practical wisdom, a repository of human experience that can be consulted whenever life presents difficult choices or challenging circumstances. The advice given is rarely direct or prescriptive. Instead, the Griot offers stories that illuminate the situation from multiple angles, allowing the seeker to draw their own conclusions. A young woman uncertain about whether to defy her parents. Choice of husband might hear stories about both dutiful daughters who found happiness through obedience and independent-minded women who chose their own paths. The stories don't tell her what to do, but they expand her understanding of the options available and their potential consequences. This indirect approach to guidance reflects a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. The Griot recognizes that people are more likely to accept and act on wisdom that they discover for themselves than on advice that is imposed from outside. By offering stories rather than instructions, the Griot allows individuals to maintain their dignity and autonomy, while still benefiting from the accumulated wisdom of their culture. The economic position of griots in Mali society is complex and reflects the ambivalent relationship that many societies have with their artists and intellectuals. On one hand, griots are essential to the functioning of their communities. They preserve cultural memory, provide entertainment, offer counsel, facilitate social relationships through their knowledge of genealogies and connections. Their services are in constant demand, and successful griots can achieve considerable wealth and influence. On the other hand, griots occupy a somewhat marginal position in the social hierarchy. They are not farmers who produce food, not warriors who provide protection, not merchants who generate wealth through trade. Their value lies in their knowledge and skill, resources that are essential but intangible, valuable but difficult to quantify. This creates a situation where griots are simultaneously respected and held at a certain distance, honored for their abilities, but sometimes viewed with suspicion because of their power to influence reputation and public opinion. The griot families, like other specialized occupations in West African society, tend to be endogamous griots marry other griots, maintaining the knowledge and skills within hereditary bloodlines. This practice ensures that the complex education required to become a competent griot begins in earliest childhood and continues throughout life. Children in griot families absorb the stories, songs, and techniques of their profession through daily exposure, learning not just the content, but the subtle performance skills that distinguish masterful griots from mere competent ones. But this hereditary system also creates challenges. Not every child born into a griot family will have the memory, musical ability, and charisma required for excellence in the profession. Some may be drawn to other occupations, while others may struggle with the demanding requirements of mastering thousands of stories, songs, and genealogies. The tradition must balance the advantages of hereditary transmission with the need to maintain high standards of performance and knowledge. As the evening's performance draws toward its close, Mamadou shifts once more into the role that may be most important of all, the keeper of hope. The stories he tells now are not the complex historical narratives or the cautionary moral tales of earlier in the evening, but the simple, powerful stories that remind his audience of their connection to something larger than themselves, something that has endured through all the changes and challenges of history and will continue to endure into an uncertain future. These are the stories that speak to the deepest human needs, the need to belong, to matter, to be part of something meaningful and enduring. They are stories about the resilience of communities, the power of human cooperation, the possibility of overcoming seemingly impossible obstacles through courage, wisdom, and mutual support. They are stories that transform individual listeners into members of a community, separate families into parts of a larger whole, present challenges into episodes in an ongoing narrative that has meaning and direction. In the final song of the evening, as the kora strings whisper softly in the cooling air, the compound settles toward sleep. Mamadou weaves together all the threads of the evening's performance. The genealogies that established legitimacy and connection to the past, the moral tales that provided guidance for present challenges, the entertainment that brought joy and community together, the counsel that helped individuals navigate life's complexities, all become part of a single, unified vision of human existence as meaningful, connected, and ongoing. This is the ultimate gift of the griot tradition, not just the preservation of historical facts or the entertainment of audiences, but the creation of meaning and community through the power of shared narrative. In a world where most people live and die within a few miles of their birthplace, where the larger forces of history often seem distant and incomprehensible, the griot provides a framework for understanding individual lives as part of larger patterns, temporary setbacks as episodes in ongoing stories, present struggles as connections to ancestral wisdom and future possibilities. As the last notes of the kora fade into the night silence and the household prepares for sleep, the griot's work continues in a different form. The stories told tonight will be remembered, discussed, modified, and retold. The genealogies recited will influence marriage negotiations and political alliances. The moral guidance offered will shape decisions and actions. The entertainment provided will be recalled and shared, creating connections between this evening and countless others like it throughout the empire. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the gride finally sets aside his instrument and settles into his own rest, he carries with him the satisfaction of having fulfilled his hereditary obligation to serve as the living bridge between past and future, the human repository of cultural memory, the voice that keeps the great story of his people alive for another day, another generation, another century of telling. The world of the Grioda world, where memory is more precious than gold, where stories have the power to shape reality, where the voice of a single individual can carry the wisdom of an entire civilization, reminds us that human knowledge and culture are not abstract concepts preserved in books and institutions, but living realities carried forward by real people who dedicate their lives to the preservation and transmission of what matters most. In the Empire of Mali, as in many traditional societies, these living libraries walked among the people as friends, advisors, entertainers, and guides. They were the keepers of identity, the weavers of meaning, the voices that transformed the raw material of human experience into the finished art of cultural memory. Their legacy continues today in the descendants who still carry forward the ancient traditions, reminding us that some of the most important human knowledge cannot be written down or digitized, but must be passed from heart to heart, from voice to voice, from one generation to the next, through the ancient miracle of storytelling. Conclusion. As our journey through the Mali Empire draws to its close, we find ourselves in that quiet space between night and dawn, between the stories we have shared and the sleep that awaits. We have walked the scholarly streets of Timbuktu, where books were more precious than gold, and learning illuminated the desert like a second sun. We have followed the legendary caravan of Mansa Musa across the Sahara, witnessing generosity so magnificent it changed the economies of empires. We have stood before the great mosque of Jen, watching an entire community renew their sacred space through collective labor and love. And we have sat in the firelight with the Griots, listening as living memory transformed the past into guidance for the present. These glimpses into the world of medieval West Africa reveal a civilization of remarkable sophistication and beauty, a place where wealth served wisdom, where diversity strengthened rather than divided communities, where the ancient and the innovative lived in creative harmony. The Mali Empire at its height was not just a political entity, but a demonstration of human possibility, proof that different peoples could come together to create something greater than the sum of their parts. The lessons of Mali speak across the centuries with surprising clarity. In an age when we often assume that progress requires the abandonment of tradition, Timbuktu showed how new learning could enrich rather than replace ancient wisdom. In a time when we sometimes view cultural differences as sources of conflict, the markets and mosques of Mali demonstrated how diversity could become a source of strength and creativity. In an era when we often separate the practical from the spiritual, the daily life of the empire revealed how commerce and scholarship, politics and faith, individual ambition and community welfare could work together in harmony. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Mali reminds us that greatness can emerge from the most unexpected places, that human creativity and cooperation know no boundaries of geography or culture. The mud walls of Jen, rising from the earth through community effort, stand as eloquent testimony to the power of collective action guided by shared vision. The golden caravan of Mansa Musa, carrying the wealth of Africa to the centers of world civilization, demonstrates what becomes possible when resources are guided by genuine faith and generous hearts. The voices of the Griots, carrying forward the accumulated wisdom of generations, remind us that the most important human knowledge, the understanding of how to live well together, how to create meaning from the raw material of existence, how to build communities that endure, cannot be captured in books or preserved in institutions, but must be passed from heart to heart, from one generation to the next, through the ancient miracle of shared story. As you settle into sleep tonight, carry with you the gentle rhythms of the Mali Empire. The morning calls to prayer echoing across the rooftops of Timbuktu, the patient pace of caravans crossing the vast Sahara, the annual renewal of the great mosque through loving hands, the soft voice of the guide weaving past and present into stories that make sense of human existence. These rhythms speak to something timeless in human experience, something that transcends the particular circumstances of any single civilization or era. The Empire of Mali, like all human creations, eventually faded. Political power shifted, trade routes changed, new technologies and new ideas transformed the ancient patterns of life. But the deeper achievements, the demonstration that human beings can create beauty together, can build communities based on learning and mutual respect, can transform individual lives into shared meaning. These achievements endure, carried forward not in monuments of stone, but in the continuing human capacity for hope, creativity, and cooperation. In the quiet darkness that surrounds you now, let the story of Mali serve as a gentle reminder that the world has always been larger and more wonderful than any single perspective can capture, that human civilizations have flourished in places and ways that confound our expectations, that the capacity for greatness lies dormant in every human heart, waiting for the right combination of circumstance, vision, and courage to bring it to life. Rest well, knowing that you are part of the same great human story that produced the scholars of Timbuktu, the pilgrimage of Mansa Musa, the builders of Jen, and the griots who kept the memory of it all alive through the power of voice and story. Tomorrow will bring its own opportunities for learning, for generosity, for creation, for the small acts of cooperation and care that, accumulated over time, create the civilizations that future generations will remember with wonder and gratitude. The golden age of Mali is past, but the human capacity for creating golden ages continues, carried forward in every person who chooses learning over ignorance, generosity over greed, cooperation over conflict, hope over despair. May your dreams tonight be filled with the gentle sounds of that distant empire, the rustle of manuscript pages in Timbuktu's libraries, the bells of Mansa Musa's caravan crossing the desert, the voices of the community replastering their beloved mosque, and the soft music of the Kora as the guide's voice carries the great story forward into another day, another year, another century of human possibility. Sleep well, and let the wisdom of ages guide you gently into rest.